Mark had always loved motorbikes. As a young man, he spent hours in the garage with his father, learning about engines and riding. That passion grew into a hobby that connected him with friends who shared his love for biking. Together, they formed a club, not for formality, but for the pure joy of riding. Now in his mid-40s, the bike club was Mark's escape, a place where he could find comfort and a sense of belonging. His workaholic nature had strained his personal life, resulting in a painful divorce and a strained relationship with his son. Seeking a fresh start, Mark moved to Cornwall, hoping to rebuild. The bike club became his sanctuary, offering him a place to forget his troubles and enjoy the camaraderie of others. On September 19, 1998, the club's annual barbecue was in full swing. Food and drinks flowed, and more than a dozen motorbikes were parked among the dunes. It was a celebration to mark the end of the season. Mark, tall and broad-shouldered with a thick beard, spotted her as she arrived. She stood out, dressed in a long denim skirt, heavy sweater, and overcoat on the unusually warm evening, while everyone else wore swimsuits. Mark approached her, inviting her to join their group. He noticed the signs of distress in her: unkempt hair, sleepless eyes, a look he recognized well. She declined and moved further down the beach. Back with his friends, Mark was the target of teasing, especially from Tommy, who joked about his interest in the woman. "She's no bag lady, Mark," Tommy said with a grin. "Those clothes cost more than my bike." But there was concern in his voice. "She's troubled, though." Tommy, a stockbroker by day and biker by night, was one of Mark's closest friends. "She's not your problem. Come on, back to the party." But Mark couldn't shake his thoughts about her. The party continued, but his mind lingered on her. As darkness fell and the last of the bikes pulled away, Mark made his way through the dunes to where she sat, alone and staring at the sea. As the tide retreated, she walked into the water. Mark, sensing her intent, hurried after her, stripping off his clothes. The water was up to her knees when he reached her. "Hey," he called out, but she ignored him. The waves crashed against her thighs. Mark swam toward her, his heart pounding. Just as she was about to throw herself into the tide, he grabbed her around the waist. She screamed, startled, and fought to break free. "I'm sorry," Mark shouted over the waves. "I can't let you do this. Leave me alone. I want to die," she screamed back. "If we go any further, we'll both drown. Is that what you want?" Mark spun her around to face him, his hands holding her shoulders. "Let me go. I don't want to live," she cried, sobbing violently. "If you go out there, I'll have to try to save you. I'm not a good swimmer, and we'll both drown." She looked into his eyes, tears streaming down her face. Her body trembled with deep sobs. "Please, let me help you," Mark whispered. "Just come out of the water. I don't want to lose you." Gently, he led her back to the dry sand, his eyes never leaving her. Once back on land, Mark took off her soaking wet coat. "This is ruined," he said, inspecting it. "The skirt's probably okay, but the sweater's done. You need to change before you catch cold." Without waiting for her reply, he offered her his jeans and sweatshirt. "Here, wear these. I've got a jacket in the truck." She looked at him expectantly, reaching for the waistband of her skirt. "Turn around," she said. Mark, apologizing, turned his back. "It's okay, you can look now." When he turned back, he couldn't help but laugh. The jeans were far too long, and she had to hold them up, while the sweatshirt sleeves covered her hands completely. "Sorry, but I have to laugh. That outfit, well, it fits where it touches." He kneeled to roll up the legs of his jeans. "Let me do this, and I've got some rope in the truck we can use for a belt." After adjusting the jeans, Mark smiled. "Now that you've gotten into my jeans, I think I deserve to know your name." "Grace," she said, her voice quieter now. "Grace Sanderson." "Nice to meet you, Grace," Mark replied, relieved to see her calmer. "I'm Mark Lawson. Let's find you a belt and get off this beach before it gets too cold." Together, they walked toward the truck. Mark found some rope, made a makeshift belt, and tightened it around her waist. After they climbed into the truck, he started the engine. As they drove away, Grace asked, "Mark, why are you doing this?" "Because I want to," he said simply. "And because I owe someone." He would have said more, but just then, something in the moonlight caught his eye. A tall woman in a white swimsuit walking out of the surf. Mark reached over, shaking Grace's leg. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing. Grace looked out the window, but when she turned back, she saw nothing but waves and sand. "See what?" Mark squinted into the darkness, but the figure was gone. He shook his head. "No, nothing. I thought I saw someone." "Mark, are you okay?" Grace asked, her voice laced with concern. "I'm fine," he said, snapping back to reality. "Let's get you some fish and chips. I'm guessing you haven't eaten in a while." As Mark drove toward Padstow, he glanced over at Grace, wondering what was going through her mind. Mark hoped he was doing the right thing by showing Grace kindness. As they drove, the silence stretched between them until Grace broke it. "What do you mean, you owe someone?" "Someone helped me once," Mark explained quietly. "I can't repay them, so I try to pay it forward. Ask me about it later." Grace didn't press. "Where are we going for fish and chips?" Mark smiled, pulling into a small, unassuming shop. "We're here." He jumped out, opened the door for her, and led her inside. Grace glanced around, confused. "I thought you said fish and chips. This looks like a fancy restaurant." "It's just a chip shop," Mark assured her. "The restaurant's across town. Trust me, they know me here." The man behind the counter greeted Mark warmly. "Hi, Mark. Expecting a crowd tonight?" "Not tonight, Paul. Just a table for two," Mark replied. Paul hesitated, looking at the empty shop. "Sorry, Mark. We're closed." Mark looked around the shop, then smiled. "I can see you're slammed. How about you put some cod and chips on a plate for the lady? I'll take a chip buddy, and I'll even do the washing up." Paul laughed. "You? Do the washing up?" "Sure, Mark." "What drinks do you want?" Paul asked. "I'll have coffee. The lady might prefer hot chocolate," Mark said. "Right, you two. Go sit down." "I'll bring them over," Paul said, still laughing. Mark went to the restroom, and when he returned, their food was waiting. Grace looked up at him, her eyes softer now. "They think a lot of you here," she said. "Paul's a mate," Mark said, leaning back in his chair. "Frustrated biker like me." Grace nodded, but then added, "The waitress spoke highly of you." "What waitress?" Mark asked, puzzled. "The restaurant's closed." "The one who wiped the tables. Tall, mid-30s, dark hair," Grace described. "She said you were the nicest man she knew." Mark looked around, but the restaurant was empty. "She's gone. All the staff left half an hour ago. Paul's alone here." Grace's expression didn't change. "I know what I saw and heard. She said good things about you." Mark shook his head, trying to dismiss it. "Your description sounds like someone I used to know, but it couldn't have been her." He nodded toward her plate. "Eat up and tell me what you think." After the meal, Mark noticed how drained Grace looked. She'd eaten most of her food but was clearly exhausted. When he parked in his driveway and turned off the engine, she didn't wake. He quietly closed the truck door, opened his front door, and carried her inside. He gently placed her in the guest room, removed her belt, jeans, and sweatshirt, and covered her with a duvet. Despite her disheveled state, he found her beautiful. "Sweet dreams, fair princess," he whispered before quietly leaving the room. After locking up the truck, Mark poured himself a glass of wine, still lost in thought about Grace's troubled state. It wasn't about money. Her clothes were expensive. For a moment, memories of his ex-wife, Sophie, surfaced, but he quickly pushed them aside, focusing on the woman in the next room. He put Grace's clothes in the wash and climbed into bed, reflecting on the strange events of the day. Just after midnight, he heard a soft knock on his bedroom door. Grace appeared in the doorway, looking apologetic. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaky. "I just had to check. Was that all a dream? Can't sleep?" Mark asked, his voice gentle. "I woke up somewhere strange and panicked," she admitted. "Did you undress me?" Mark nodded. "Yes, but I left your underwear on. Your skirt's in the wash." "Thank you," Grace whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't have anything clean to sleep in. Do you have something I can wear?" "I've got some shirts in the wardrobe and t-shirts in the second drawer," Mark offered. Grace took a shirt and went to the bathroom. When she returned, Mark felt the bed shift as she climbed in beside him. "Would you hold me?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "I really need someone." As he held her, she broke down in sobs, her body trembling against his. He simply held her, waiting for her to calm down. After a while, they both drifted off to sleep. The next morning, Mark woke up to an empty bed. He showered and went to the kitchen, where he found Grace making coffee and toast. "I was going to make breakfast, but I wasn't sure what you liked," she said, glancing up at him. "Do you have an iron? My skirt is full of creases." Mark smiled. "I'll grab the iron." As he set it up, he asked, "Egg and bacon okay?" Grace nodded as he made breakfast. She kept glancing at him with an intensity he couldn't ignore. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "So, do you want to tell me what led up to last night?" Grace hesitated, shaking her head. "I don't want to burden you with my problems. You've done more than enough. I should go." "You can leave if you want," Mark said, more firmly than he intended. "But it might be difficult in just your skirt and underwear. I'll drive you wherever you need." Grace's eyes lingered on Mark for a moment, and then he noticed the gold wedding band on her left hand, topped with a diamond. "I see you're married. Do you want to call your husband and tell him where you are?" Grace's face crumpled. She started crying again, and Mark immediately understood. He moved beside her, gently cradling her face in his hands. "Trouble with your husband?" She nodded through her tears. "I don't have a husband anymore. He's divorcing me." Mark sat down beside her, waiting for her to calm down. "Is that why you went to the beach last night?" "Partly," she whispered. "I've always been the one people lean on. I lead a team of accountants, helping clients with tax plans. But now, I can't even handle my own life." "That's not silly," Mark said gently. "Divorce is as hard as losing a loved one." Grace nodded, tears still falling. "There were no signs. We were married for 10 years and trying to start a family. 3 weeks ago, he told me he loved someone else and moved out," Grace explained, her voice trembling. "But since then, what's happened?" Mark asked gently. "I saw him with her on Friday at Mother Care. She's pregnant, giving him the baby I couldn't. I felt worthless, unloved. I ended up here without thinking," Grace whispered. "Do you still feel that way?" Mark asked, his tone soft. "I don't know. I don't think so." She squeezed Mark's hands. "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here. I owe it to both of us to make the best of it." "Well, we've got a busy day ahead," Mark said, giving her a small smile. "You need clothes, and you should talk to Angie." "I lost my purse last night," Grace said quietly. "My ID, credit cards, everything." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Does a motorcycle mechanic make enough to loan me some money?" "I'm not a mechanic," Mark replied. "I own the dealership. Don't worry about the money. Angie's a solicitor. She can help you with the divorce." Grace looked at him, half smiling. "Is there anything you haven't thought of?" "Yeah," Mark said, with a teasing grin. "How I'll ever wear that shirt again without thinking of you in it." Grace rolled her eyes but smiled as she went to get dressed. They spent the morning in Yuki, shopping for clothes. As they drove, Grace observed Mark closely. His dark beard, gray hair, and strong physique hinted at his age, around 45. She felt safe with him, but also wondered what had led her to climb into his bed that night. She was relieved when he turned away, letting her snuggle against his back. By 2 p.m., they were done shopping. They sat at a cafe, drinking coffee and making plans. Mark called Angie and arranged a visit, then gave Grace a tour of the area. Grace noticed how much respect Mark seemed to command. Why does a man with so much going for him seem so alone and sad? She wondered. At Angie's, Mark left Grace with her while he and Angie's husband, John, discussed bikes over beers. An hour later, Grace, looking tearful, asked to go home. On the drive back, Mark asked, "How did it go with Angie?" "She said the same as you. I can't stop the divorce, so I need the best settlement. She suggested I try IVF with a new partner and use the settlement for that." Grace paused, then added, "She helped me realize it wasn't my fault. My husband didn't leave me because I couldn't have children. He started cheating before I even knew." Grace then shifted the conversation. "Mark, who is Wellard?" Mark was taken aback. "What?" Angie said if I wanted to know you, I should ask you about Wellard. Mark laughed, then explained. Wellard is a nickname. It started at the St. Paul's Carnival in Bristol. There was trouble with some National Front skinheads. A young kid was attacked, and the police weren't doing anything. I rode straight at them, and one came back with a knife. I knocked him out with my helmet. Angie sorted it with the cops. The guy I knocked out was a repeat offender. Grace raised an eyebrow. But why Wellard? Mark smiled. The kid I helped said, "You is Wellard for an old guy." The name stuck, and my biker friends started calling me that. So you're not just my hero, you're everyone's knight in shining armor, Grace teased. I'm just trying to do the right thing, Mark said modestly. Grace leaned on his shoulder. I'm glad you do. Whatever led me to your beach did me a huge favor. After a while, Grace asked, "Can I cook for you tonight?" "If that's what you want," Mark said, smiling. Grace's excitement was palpable as she squeezed his arm. She moved around the kitchen, glancing at him often, feeling drawn to him. She wanted him, but wasn't sure how to make the first move. She remembered how he hadn't made a move the previous night. Maybe he doesn't fancy me, she thought, but she decided to take a chance, to be vulnerable. For the first time in 2 years, Mark ate a meal he hadn't cooked himself. He couldn't take his eyes off Grace as she moved around the kitchen. He admired her figure and remembered the sight of her lying on the bed. After dinner, Grace made coffee, then kissed him on the lips. Mark responded immediately, pulling her onto his lap. Their kiss deepened, and Grace pulled away, catching her breath. "Well, that answers one question," she said, teasing. "You're straight?" "Of course, who said I wasn't?" Mark responded, surprised. "No one. People say what a lovely man you are, but there's no woman in your life." "I just wondered," Grace explained. Mark nodded. "Well, you were at my mercy last night, and I didn't try to seduce you. Maybe you think I don't find you attractive?" Grace shook her head. "No, I don't think that. I'm just glad to know you," she said softly, resting her head on his shoulder. Grace gazed into his eyes, hoping he'd say it wasn't true, that he didn't just see her as someone to rescue. Grace wanted him to take her in his arms, to love her. She held her breath, waiting for his response. "If I'd taken advantage of you last night, I would have lost your respect," Mark said softly. "I turned away so you wouldn't notice what was happening to me. As for not finding you attractive, I think I've just shown you that I do." Her heart raced. She wanted him, but wondered if she should make the first move. She loved his gentlemanly nature, but feared it might hold him back. She decided to act. "I'm glad," she said, looking down at the floor, her red hair falling across her face. "You've been so good to me, and I need to ask you another favor. Would you make love to me, please?" Mark was flustered. It had been almost 2 years since he'd been with anyone. He thought about it and realized that Grace wasn't offering herself out of gratitude, but because she wanted him. "Grace, I'm flattered, but making love is important to me. I don't want to do it out of obligation. It has to be because we care about each other." Grace's voice softened. "I should feel insulted, but I don't. I'm not offering my body as a thank you. I'm asking because you're the most wonderful man I've ever met. You saved me. If you didn't care, you would have left me to the police or a hospital. Please, Mark, take me upstairs and make love to me." Grace took his hand and led him upstairs. In his bedroom, they stood by the bed, sharing a kiss. "I've never kissed a man with a beard before," she giggled. "It's soft and tickles my nose." Mark pulled her closer, and their kisses deepened. They made love. Afterward, Grace lay beside him, her head resting on his chest. "I could stay here forever. Can I stay, Mark?" "You can stay as long as you want," he replied, kissing her gently. "I think I should take a shower. Is there room for 2? They showered together, then snuggled back into bed. As they drifted to sleep, Grace looked at him with love in her eyes. The next morning, Mark woke to find her gazing at him with affection. "Wow," she said, kissing him. "You were right. It was even better than before. You were so good to me. I don't deserve this." "You think it's one-sided?" Mark asked. "You gave me the best night of my life. You deserve everything I can give you." They kissed again, but soon Grace got up. Mark realized he would be late for work. Over breakfast, they discussed their plans. Mark had to work, and Grace planned to visit the bank to repay him. That evening, Mark found Grace distressed. The bank had refused her access to her accounts because she didn't have ID, which had been in her lost purse. She needed to go home to get her passport and prove who she was. "I must go home, Mark," she said. "I need to sort things out. I have a job, and my company will want to know why I missed work. I've canceled my cards, but replacements will be sent to my home. Once I have my passport, I can access my money." Mark looked sad. "Can you do me a favor? Buy me a train ticket back to Radlett? I'll repay you when I can access my bank account," she asked. "The money isn't important," Mark replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want you to leave. I enjoy having you here." Grace smiled softly. "And I love being here. Honestly, I think I'm falling for you. But I need to take control of my life first. There's so much to do. Get my finances in order, deal with my possessions. Douglas has moved out, so I'm selling the house." Mark listened quietly. "I understand, but this isn't the end. It's more like the beginning, if you want it to be." "You know what I want," he said with a heavy heart. "If getting you back means I lose you for a while, then that's what I must do." The night passed in each other's arms, and the next morning, Mark drove her to the station. As they arrived, the London train pulled away. With an hour to wait for the next one, they settled in the station cafe. "Grace, when I said I owed someone, it didn't seem like money. Can you tell me who you owe?" she asked. Mark looked down, his eyes darkening. "Her name is Olivia Morgan. I owe her my life. It's nothing special, just something I can't repay." Grace leaned closer. "Tell me the story," she urged. Mark hesitated. "Okay, but it's a long one, and you might not like it." "I want to hear it," Grace said softly, her gaze fixed on his. 2 years ago, I founded a software company, Lawson Software Solutions, right out of college," Mark began. "It took off quickly. Everyone was buying PCs, and Windows made them easier to use. We developed commercial software, and our company floated on the stock market. My wife, Sophie, and I had control of the business. We also brought in a partner with management expertise. Things were good for a while, but demand for our software declined as Microsoft started developing hardware. I knew we couldn't rely on our current model, so I explored new revenue streams, bespoke software for businesses, and digital TV boxes. My partner Adrian opposed these ideas, but with 60% of the shares, Sophie and I had the final say. This marked the beginning of our troubles. I spent months traveling for contracts, neglecting my family. I was so focused on the company's growth that I missed my family's needs. Then I landed our biggest deal, a contract for digital TV set-top boxes. I was ecstatic and planned a holiday to make it up to Sophie. But when I got home, everything had changed. Adrian's car was in the driveway, and inside, Sophie, Adrian, and my son Elliot were waiting for me. I excitedly shared the news, but no one reacted. Adrian finally said, "Sit down, Mark." Confused, I sat. "We've shut down the development section," Adrian said. "The company can't afford it. We're sticking to what we know." "On whose authority?" I demanded. "Sophie and I have controlling interest." "I'm the CEO," Adrian replied. Sophie sat beside him, her hand on his. "We had an emergency shareholders meeting yesterday," Adrian continued. "We voted you off the board. We're profitable without financing your projects." I was stunned. "This has nothing to do with you sleeping with my wife?" "No," Adrian said. "That's separate. This is business." I'm grateful to Sophie for her support. Sophie added, "He's right. Your spending was out of control. We had to stop you before you ruined the company." "Really, Sophie?" I spat. "Whose bed were you in when he told you that?" She handed me an envelope with divorce papers citing irreconcilable differences. "I won't take you to the cleaners, Mark. You've been a good husband, but it's not working anymore. I hope we can still be friends." "Friends?" I sneered. "You steal my company, sleep with the enemy, and expect to remain friends?" Sophie's expression softened. "I hope you'll reconsider once you've calmed down. We still have our son to think about." I looked at my son. "Elliot, what's your part in this?" "I'm going to live with Mom and Adrian," he replied, emotionless. "So, he's taken my company, My wife, and now my son? Is that it? Dad, Elliot said flatly, you made me go to the local school when you could afford private fees. I never saw any benefit from that. Your mother paid the private school fees, not me, I said, my voice tight. Yeah, but Adrian's the one who did it, Elliot said, shaking his head. He paid because you wouldn't. I stood there, unable to speak. My mind was reeling. You're selling me out for 2 years of school fees and a new car? Look, Mark, Adrian said, standing up, this is a lot to take in. We should leave you alone for a while. He extended his right hand, but I gripped it with my left and punched him in the face, knocking him to the floor. You've stolen my company, my family. Of course, it's personal. Sophie helped Adrian up. We're leaving tonight. Maybe you'll reconsider when we're gone, she said, her voice cold. As they walked out, I looked at Elliot, my son, who followed silently behind them. I closed the door and felt hollow. My life had revolved around my wife, my company, and later, my son. In less than an hour, it was all gone. I sat, numb. On TV, men in my position reached for a bottle, but I didn't understand that. I wasn't looking to drink. I was looking for something to make the pain go away, but there was nothing. I wandered the house aimlessly. It was dark, then light again, but none of it mattered. I ignored the phone ringing. All I could think about was the holidays in Cornwall with my parents, both of whom were dead. Those memories only made me miss them more. I knew I had to leave. I walked out of the house and ended up on the beach, where I'd played as a child. It didn't make me happy. It just made me miss my parents more. The tide was going out, and I walked further into the ocean. It seemed fitting to end my empty life there, surrounded by the memories of better times. But as I walked deeper into the water, suddenly, there she was, standing in the sea, looking at me. She was tall, with long dark hair, wearing a white swimsuit. This is not the way, Mark, she said softly. Turn around, let's go back. Why? I asked, voice hollow. What's the point? There's no reason to go back. There is always a reason to live, she said. There are things you have to do, people you have to meet. What are you talking about? And how do you know my name? I'm talking about you. It's not your time. If you go further, I'll have to save you. Turn around and come with me. She extended her hand. Come with me, Mark. I was confused. Who are you? Do I know you? My name is Olivia, she replied calmly. No, you don't know me, but I know you. Please, come with me. Without thinking, I took her hand and followed. She moved gracefully out of the waves. I noticed she looked to be around 35. She led me to a house in the dunes, a colonial-style bungalow. She guided me inside and disappeared briefly, leaving me alone to process what had just happened. When she returned, she handed me a towel and led me to the bathroom. Take a shower, she said. You look like you haven't slept in days. I shuffled toward the bathroom in a daze, but as soon as I stepped in, she was there, helping me undress. I didn't protest. She joined me under the shower, washing my hair and rubbing my back. You're in shock, she murmured. But don't worry, I can fix you. She led me to the bedroom afterward, still naked, and tucked me into bed. I fell into a deep sleep. When I woke, it was dark. I felt a weight on me and assumed it was Sophie. But when I turned, something felt off. I reached for the bedside lamp, only it wasn't there. I panicked. What's going on? Where are we? The light flicked on, and I saw Olivia beside me, not Sophie. Everything rushed back. Oh God, it wasn't a dream, was it? Olivia took my chin, kissing me gently. No, Mark, it wasn't a dream. It all happened. But it doesn't have to be as bad as you think. She looked at me, her eyes intense. Look at me, Mark. Don't you like what you see? I swallowed hard. Yes, you're beautiful. Any man would be lucky to wake up with you. But you're not the woman I love. Are you still in love with her? She asked, her voice soft. I don't know anymore, I replied. She doesn't love me. She chose Adrian over me. Olivia kissed me again, more deeply. Don't be too hard on her. You know why he seduced her. But the question is, do you want her back? I hesitated, torn. I don't think so. She chose Adrian. I'd always feel second best. Olivia kissed me again, her lips soft and reassuring. Never think of yourself as second best, Mark. You're more than that. I met her gaze, the pull between us undeniable. Now, she said, are you going to use this weapon? Or do I have to wait another day? I was still disoriented. Another day? It's 2 a.m. I've been sleeping for 30 hours straight. Olivia pulled me closer, her lips finding mine again. I'm a normal woman with normal needs. When I share a bed with a hot man, I get excited. I kissed her back, but still felt uncertain. I'm sorry, Olivia. Can we take it slower? I'm not sure I can handle this yet. She smiled, kissing my forehead. So, that's not a no, just a not now. I left her in bed to use the bathroom. When I returned, she was either asleep or pretending. I slipped back into bed, spooning her, and tried to sleep. My rest was fitful. I woke at 7 a.m. to the smell of coffee. I saw Olivia walking past the doorway in a short silk robe, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She placed one on the nightstand and kissed me softly. Well, that was a pleasant surprise, she whispered. Your wife was lucky. She thinks she still is, with Adrian now. I know all about it, Mark. It's her loss. I stared at her, processing her words. How can you say that? I hardly know you. Olivia stroked my face gently. And that's what you do for someone you hardly know. Imagine how much more you would do for someone you care about. Her words hit me harder than I expected. Take my word for it, she said. It's her loss. Now, she added, how about breakfast and then a swim? For the next 6 weeks, Olivia and I spent our time together. We swam, soaked up the sun, and made love. Sometimes even in the middle of the day. In the evenings, we would talk for hours. I poured out my frustrations about losing my family, my company, everything I had built. Olivia didn't let me wallow. She reminded me of all my accomplishments, the people I had helped, the lives I had impacted. Her desire for me lifted my spirits, boosted my self-esteem. I began to develop feelings for her, but she made it clear that we couldn't have a real relationship. It was just temporary. As the days grew shorter, she told me she had to leave soon. The night before she left, we had a deep conversation. You're not a man who gives up, she said. You came here because you weren't in your right mind. Now, you need to go back and reclaim your life. That night, we made love tenderly. The next morning, she drove me to the station in her white Audi Quattro. We said our goodbyes. How will I know when you're back? I asked. Look for me on the beach, she replied. If I come back, that's where I'll be. I boarded the train feeling conflicted. Olivia had saved me, but the emptiness still lingered. Grace's voice interrupted my thoughts. So, Olivia is the person you owe, she said quietly. And I guess indirectly, I owe her my life too. Yes, I answered. If it wasn't for her, I wouldn't have been on that beach. Grace nodded. And if you hadn't been there, you wouldn't have recognized the look in my eyes. Mark gave a small nod. Exactly. Grace hesitated before asking, and you couldn't let me do it because you owed Olivia? I paused. Not entirely. I could never have let you do it, Grace. Things are never that bad. She smiled softly. I know. I had to make you see that. Grace's curiosity grew. So what happened when you went back? Why didn't you ever find Olivia? Mark took a deep breath. That's where the story gets strange. On the train ride back, I realized something felt off. I bought a newspaper to catch up on the 6 weeks I had missed. No radio, no TV, nothing. I glanced at the headlines, and my heart sank. It stunned me to see stories from the day my life unraveled still making headlines. The newspaper claimed it had been only 10 days since that fateful day. Skeptical, I assumed it was an old paper, so I sought out the vendor to clarify. He assured me it was the current edition and pointed to the date. To confirm, I pulled out my train ticket. It, too, bore the same date. Feeling disoriented and a little embarrassed, I returned to my seat. When the conductor came around to check tickets, he verified the date as well. Reluctantly, I accepted the reality and went back to my crossword puzzle, hoping to find solace in something mundane. By mid-afternoon, I arrived home to find the answering machine's light blinking insistently. The first few messages were inconsequential, a quick question from a neighbor, a call from the dry cleaners. Then came the more pressing ones. My secretary left a message, urgently asking me to call her, even providing her home number. Sophie's voice followed, filled with worry, pleading for me to pick up. My solicitor also left a message, saying we needed to talk immediately. More messages trickled in, each one more desperate than the last. My secretary called again, expressing her concern for my safety. Then there was Sophie, my wife, once more proclaiming her love for me, begging to know I was okay. Hearing her voice was like a punch to the gut. I knew there was no way I'd be calling her back. Instead, I called Michael Foster, my solicitor, who had been with my company since its inception. Michael confirmed what I already suspected. Sophie, along with a man named Bennett, had attempted to access company files, claiming I was no longer the CEO. Michael, ever the diligent guardian, had blocked them and frozen my bank accounts to safeguard my assets. I thanked him for his quick thinking and scheduled a meeting for the next day to sign papers and weigh my options. Next, I dialed Janet, my loyal secretary. She sounded relieved to hear from me and admitted that she'd been considering quitting her job due to the mess Sophie and Bennett had caused. She stayed only because she needed the income. I reassured her that she'd done the right thing and promised to help her find a better opportunity. We set up lunch for the next day, and I resolved to give her my car as a token of my gratitude. That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, I slept soundly. The next day was a whirlwind of activity. Michael and I finalized the paperwork, lifting the freeze on my accounts. He also referred me to a skilled divorce lawyer to protect my assets. Over lunch, Janet and I shared an emotional moment. I gave her leads for new jobs and handed her the keys to my car. It felt good to help someone who'd stood by me. At the bank, I transferred half of the joint account balance into a personal account and relinquished my joint card. Later, I arranged for a charity to pick up furniture from the house and listed the property for sale with an estate agent. I purchased a mobile phone, packed a bag, and checked into a hotel. That evening, another message from Sophie awaited me. Her voice cracked with emotion as she admitted she'd made a mistake and begged me to speak with her. I couldn't see the point, so I ignored it. Within days, I found a furnished flat in UKI. Michael connected me with a broker to sell my company shares gradually, ensuring I'd get the best price. Adrian expressed interest in buying them outright, but I was firm about selling at market value. In UKI, I spent my days searching for Olivia. The beach where we'd once shared moments of peace became my second home, though she never appeared. I discovered that the house where we'd stayed had burned down a year ago. According to a local, Olivia's husband had drowned, and she had vanished soon after. It hit me hard. Olivia wasn't coming back. At least, not in the way I'd hoped. Still, I couldn't stop returning to the beach, drawn to it by some invisible tether. Eventually, I bought a small house nearby, along with a struggling motorcycle dealership, rekindling a passion I'd nearly forgotten. Most of my free time was spent by the waves, waiting for someone who wouldn't return. I shared this part of my life with Grace one evening. "Did you ever see her again?" she asked, her hand gently resting on my arm. "No, not until the night I met you," I replied. "I thought I saw her walking out of the surf just as we were leaving the beach. It was only for a second, and then she was gone." Grace tilted her head. "Were you in love with her?" I shook my head. "I don't think so. I liked her a lot, and she was stunning. But it wasn't love. I felt like I owed her something. For those weeks, however long it was, she gave me so much, and I never got to repay her." "Do you have her picture?" Grace asked. I pulled a worn photo from my wallet, one I'd gotten from a newspaper office years ago. Grace stared at it, and the color drained from her face. "I've seen her," she whispered. "Twice. She was a waitress at the fish and chip shop. I also saw her at the fitting rooms when we went shopping. She said you were a good man." My heart skipped a beat. "Do you think she's watching over us?" Grace smiled faintly. "If she brought you to me, then I owe her my thanks." "Maybe she didn't bring me to you," I mused. "Maybe she made sure you'd be there for me." Grace's train was announced, and we walked to the platform. She promised to return soon, and as her train disappeared, I stood rooted, waving until she was gone. For the first time in years, I felt like I was no longer waiting for the past. I was looking forward to the future. The Vincent black shadow gleamed under the sun's rays as Mark dried the paint and chrome with a chamois leather. He saw a taxi pull up but didn't need to look closely. He knew who it was. She'd been asking about him around UKI. She stopped beside the bike, waiting for him to notice her. Mark kept polishing. "It's been a long time, Mark," she said. "You're looking good," she added. Mark stood up, wiped his hands on his rag, and gave her a quick look. Time hadn't been kind to her. She'd gained about 20 pounds, and her face had lost its sharpness. "You're not looking so bad yourself, Jack," he said, his tone neutral. "No need to flatter me," she replied, a resigned edge in her voice. "I know how I look." "So, what brings you here?" Mark asked, a little skeptical. "Was the divorce settlement not enough? I gave you $250,000 from the house, and you kept your company shares. Michael Foster said you were fine with the lump sum for Ian's child support." "It's nothing like that," she said quickly. "You were fair, all things considered. But let's not talk about this out here. Let's go inside." It was then Mark noticed the briefcase she was carrying. Curious, he invited her in. She looked around, nodding. "Nice place, Mark. Got a good-sized garden. 3 bedrooms, right?" "Only 3, Mark replied, but his eyes stayed on her. "But you didn't come here to admire my house. What do you want?" As Mark started the coffee machine, he waited for her to speak. "It's you I want," she said, her voice low but firm. "I've come to ask you to come back." Mark stopped, stunned. Sophie laughed at his reaction. No, I didn't mean that. I'm not asking you to come back to me, though I would if I thought it would work. I know I burned my bridges with the divorce papers." Her voice turned darker. "It wasn't until I lost you that I realized what I really wanted. You don't know what you've got until it's gone." Mark crossed his arms, not moved. "You lost me when I found out about you and Adrian. You two acted like lovers. That was enough for me." Jack stiffened. "How's Ian?" "I'm guessing he's firmly with Adrian now." "I tried to stop him, Mark." "I really did," Jack admitted, her frustration building. "But he's an adult now. If he wants to change his name, there's nothing I can do. He still looks up to Adrian." "Give him time," Mark replied, his voice calm. "He's still young." "He's had 7 years, Mark," she shot back. "That's enough." A beat of silence passed before Mark pressed. "What about you? Did things not work out with Adrian?" Jack's voice softened. "Do you remember what you said to me as we left the house?" she asked, trembling slightly. Mark nodded. "I do. It haunts me." She whispered the words, "When a man marries his mistress, it creates a vacancy." Mark smirked bitterly. It didn't take long for him to fill that vacancy. Jack's eyes darkened. "It didn't help that I was still in love with you. You never asked me why I did it. I don't even know myself." He was so damn persuasive. "The silver tongue doesn't help when you're stuck together all the time," Mark replied dryly. "Once I found out he was cheating, that was it." Jack's bitterness seeped into her voice. "So what now? Have you found someone else?" "There've been a couple of people over the past 5 years, but nothing came of it," she said, almost wistfully. "You were always hard to follow, Mark." "You were always a good wife," Jack admitted, guilt in her voice. "I was a fool, letting that prick convince me you were cheating on me." "I never did," Mark said, sincerity in his eyes. "You were all I needed. I didn't want anyone else." "I know that now," Jack said quietly. "But it's too late, isn't it?" "Yes, way too late," Mark answered firmly. "So, this isn't about us. What is it really about?" Jack hesitated before answering. "We need you back at the company. We'll offer you your old job and a free hand to take the company in any direction you want." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You keep saying we. Who's we?" "The board, the bank. The company's in trouble, Mark. The bank won't lend any more money unless we come up with a solid diversification plan. We've tried, but the clients don't believe we have the expertise. We need someone with credibility, Mark." "We need you," Jack said, her voice becoming more pleading. Mark narrowed his eyes. "What does Adrian think about all this?" "He's okay with it," Jack said, sounding casual. "But it doesn't matter. He only has 30%. Thanks to the divorce, I have 35%. The rest of the board and the bank support me." Jack reached into her bag and pulled out a contract, handing it to Mark. I even brought a contract. Mark took the contract, then poured the coffee and brought 2 cups to the table. What makes you think I'd want to come back? I'm happy here. I have friends. I don't need to return to that life. Jack gave him a knowing look. Come on, Mark. You can't be happy running a motorcycle shop. Sure, it's your passion, but it doesn't challenge you mentally. Mark looked away, avoiding her gaze. But as he did, he noticed a Toyota MPV pulling up. A slim redhead got out and helped 2 children out of the car. They walked toward the door. Mark stood up, moving toward the door. Expecting someone? Jack asked, eyeing the children. No, Mark replied simply as he opened the door. The children rushed in and hugged his legs. Daddy, why didn't you come swimming with us today? The boy asked. Mark squatted to their level. Because, little man, I was expecting a visitor who came all the way from London. Is she here now, Daddy? The girl asked, smiling up at him. Yes, darling, Mark said, smiling back as the kids clung to him. She's over there at the table, Mark replied, standing up to hug the young woman and kiss her. Sophie felt a twinge of jealousy as she watched them. We missed you at the pool today, Grace said, wrapping her arm around Mark's waist. Are you going to introduce us? They walked back to the table. As Sophie extended her hand, Mark made the introductions. Sophie, this is Grace. Grace, this is my ex-wife, Sophie. And these are Daniel and Olivia. Mark bent down to the children. This is the lady Daddy was married to before he met Mommy. Grace shook Sophie's hand, then embraced her. Nice to meet you. I owe you so much. Sophie raised an eyebrow. What could you possibly owe me? Grace smiled. Him. These 2. My life, basically. If it wasn't for you, none of this would have happened. Sophie's eyes narrowed. Well, if you're trying to make me feel like a fool, you're doing a great job. I didn't see a wedding ring, Sophie added with a hint of sarcasm. Once bitten, twice shy, Grace replied lightly. Sophie changed the subject. Were you expecting me today? Mark responded. After you booked your taxi last night, someone called to say you'd be coming. Like I said, I have real friends here who care about me. He got straight to the point. So, what's the real reason you're here? I told you, I want you back, Sophie insisted. You can't have him back, Grace called from the laundry room. Sophie sighed and continued. The company's in trouble. We've had an offer, but it's all or nothing. I own 35%, Adrian has 30%, and the rest belongs to 4 shareholders. They all want to sell, and even Adrian is considering it. The bank wants us to sell to settle our overdraft. I really did come to ask you to come back. If you do, I can get the others to back me, and the bank will give us more time, Sophie pleaded, desperation in her voice. Mark shook his head. Sell, Sophie. Just let it go. Get the best deal you can. I don't want to. The company's my last link to our old life, Sophie said. I don't want to let it go. Let it go, Sophie. Take the offer, Mark urged. They won't take on our debts. I'll be left with less than $100,000. Adrian will have nothing. He remortgaged his house to buy your shares, and I got them in the divorce settlement. Please, Mark, come back and help us rebuild the company. You've done it before, and we wouldn't be in this mess if we'd let you do it your way. Mark shook his head. I'm happy here. I like what I do. Yes, I could be doing more, but I have my finger in a few other pies. Grace walked into the room. Sophie, I'm about to start lunch. Would you like to join us? Mark can drive you back to town later. Sophie looked at Mark, realizing she was wasting her time. No, thank you. I must be going. She took out her phone and called for a taxi. As soon as Sophie left, Grace walked up to Mark, wrapped her arms around his neck, and kissed him. You're a very naughty man, Mark Lawson. She doesn't know, does she? And you're not going to tell her, are you? Right on both counts, Mark grinned. The last time I found something that amusing was when my ex-husband's baby came out brown. He chuckled, adding, Of course, you getting me pregnant made it all the more enjoyable. Grace smiled mischievously. Like you said, I'm a very naughty man. On September 29, 2003, Lawson Software Solutions employees noticed the bearded man at the back of the lunchroom but were more intrigued by the slim redhead beside him in a sharp two-piece suit. Grace waited for everyone to settle, then closed the door behind her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "you know CS has been facing financial troubles. I'm pleased to announce that, as of 9 a.m., that uncertainty is over. Wellard Data Services has acquired this company." Whispers spread through the room. Wellard is a company built to meet the growing need for online data storage. We own 2 large server farms, one in Reading and one in Edinburgh. Much of our business comes from companies wanting to disaster-proof their data. CSS will add value by providing bespoke online programs. This won't yield immediate profits, so we need to release assets tied up here. We're selling this building and relocating to Truro. A voice shouted from the crowd, "No way! You can't move us to the back of Beyond. I'll take it to the board if I have to." Mark stood up. "What code do you write, Mr. Bennett?" "I'm a project manager, not a coder," Ian replied, confused. "Well, Mr. Bennett, all our project managers write code. The invitation to move to Truro won't be open to you. And you just took it to the board. I own Wellard, and now I own CSS. Again, I am the board. What I say goes, and I say we move to Truro. The sale of the London properties will pay salaries until we develop new products. If you visit Human Resources at the end of this meeting, they'll provide details about the statutory severance package," Mark said. Ian, realizing who he was dealing with, left the room. Mark continued, "Anyone who feels the same as Mr. Bennett is welcome to join him. We hope to take most of you with us, but that's your choice. We'll offer a generous relocation package. As Ms. Sanderson mentioned, this building and the company flats will be sold. We're bringing in our own management team. Some of you will recognize returning staff." He added, "Mr. Adrian Bennett and Mr. Lawson no longer have roles here. I'll meet with department heads this afternoon to outline the way forward. Ms. Sanderson will answer any questions." "Thank you." After the meeting, Mark found Adrian in his former office. "Packing up?" Mark asked. Adrian nodded. "Well, I wasn't, but if you want this office, I'll move." He added, noticing Mark's beard, "Nice beard, Mark. If you hadn't spoken, I wouldn't have recognized you." "I'd like you to vacate the office and premises," Mark said firmly. Janet handed Adrian a box. "I thought you'd keep me on," Adrian said, frustrated. "It'll cost too much to get rid of me." Mark replied, "You should have read the sale contract. The previous owners are responsible for senior management contracts. You'll be suing yourself if you try." He pointed out, "You got 85 grand from the sale." Adrian sighed. "I remortgaged my house to buy your shares, Mark. I wouldn't worry. You'll find another job soon," Mark said sarcastically. "Maybe my son will share his redundancy pay with you." Adrian looked surprised. "You haven't fired him, have you?" Mark answered coolly, "He fired himself. He wouldn't go to Truro." As Adrian packed his things, Mark waited. When he picked up the box and moved toward the door, Adrian considered shaking Mark's hand but thought better of it. He left without a word. Mark sat at his old desk, feeling a sense of nostalgia. Janet entered, smiling. "It's so good to see you back where you belong." "Thank you, Janet. It's good to have you back too. Was your last employer sad to see you go?" Mark asked. "They offered a generous raise, but I knew who I wanted to work for," Janet replied. "We plan to retire in Cornwall now that we're empty nesters. My husband's already got a job there. Is it okay with him?" Mark asked. "Oh, yes, sir," Janet answered. "He's already been offered a job." "Janet, don't you think you've known me long enough to call me Mark?" he suggested. "I couldn't do that, Mr. Lawson. It wouldn't be right." "Is there anything you need?" he asked. "Not right now. I'll take an early lunch and be back by 2 p.m., she replied. Janet returned shortly. "Miss Sanderson is here to see you, sir." "Send her in, and then go to lunch, Janet," Mark instructed. Grace entered with a smile. "Sophie was right about one thing. That woman's sweet on you. She's a great secretary." "That's what matters," Mark replied. "I suppose this makes you my boss now," Grace teased. "I have a fantasy about my boss where I make a mistake and he punishes me." "How does he punish you?" Mark asked, amused. "I'd leave that to him, sir," she replied, her eyes twinkling. Mark stood, playing along. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll try to do better, but I have to be punished, don't I?" Grace continued the role play, Sorry, sir. I'll try to do better, but I have to be punished, don't I? Indeed you do, Mark said, smiling as he slapped her cheek playfully. Whatever you say, sir. You're the boss, Grace replied, clearly enjoying the banter. Miss Sanderson smiled, leaning in. Oh, I've learned, sir. I've learned that I'd better make more mistakes. And what would your husband say about that? Mark asked. I don't have a husband, Grace replied. My partner's too damaged by his ex-wife to try again. The man's a fool, Mark said. Why don't you marry me? Grace hesitated, pretending to be concerned. But what about my children? I'll adopt them, Mark said, pulling her closer. In that case, sir, the answer is yes, Grace replied. They shared a kiss, interrupted by a woman entering. Olivia, they said in unison. Olivia smiled and blew them a kiss before leaving. That was her, wasn't it? Grace asked, eyes wide with wonder. Mark nodded. You saw her too? She was real. I didn't dream her. Grace added, maybe she thinks we don't need her anymore. Mark pulled her closer. Now, I'll have to be your guardian angel. Grace smiled softly. Only if you'll let me be yours for the rest of our lives. It's a deal, Mark said, kissing her passionately.